Look closely at the life cycle of a hermit crab, which begins its journey by finding a discarded shell that offers perfect, impenetrable protection from chaotic ocean currents. Inside that borrowed armor, the crab feels entirely secure, insulated from predators and the harsh realities of the surrounding reef. However, as the creature inevitably grows, the exact walls that once kept it safe begin to press inward, restricting its movement and suffocating its physical development. There comes a terrifying, biologically mandated moment where the crab must abandon its fortress for the open water, or else be crushed to death by its own protective shell. Your childhood home operates on the exact same ruthless biological principle, transforming from a nurturing sanctuary into a psychological straitjacket once you pass your developmental expiration date. The first undeniable symptom of this stagnation is spatial friction, where you begin to physically and psychologically bump into the edges of an environment never designed to house a fully grown adult. Look around your childhood bedroom. The physical dimensions have not changed, yet the air feels entirely different and increasingly claustrophobic. The closet built to hold high school graphic tees is now bursting with professional attire, while your complex adult life is crammed into corners originally meant for teenage hobbies. You are trying to overlay an adult existence onto a spatial blueprint drafted for a child, creating an environmental mismatch that silently signals to your brain that you do not truly own your surroundings. Every time you have to lower your voice on the phone so your parents do not hear, or negotiate refrigerator space for your meal prep, you are experiencing the suffocating pressure of an outgrown shell. History provides a profound framework for understanding the danger of overstaying in a sanctuary through the early life of Siddhartha Gautama. Long before he became a spiritual icon, Siddhartha was a young prince trapped in an environment of absolute, suffocating perfection orchestrated by a father terrified of the world's harsh realities. Inside those opulent palace walls, Siddhartha lacked for absolutely nothing. His meals were prepared, his environment was perfectly controlled, and his daily existence was completely insulated from the friction of the outside world. Yet, as he entered his late 20s, a profound, unshakable anxiety began to take root because the extreme comfort of the palace had not produced a realized man, but rather a captive. Siddhartha recognized that his father's obsessive protection was effectively starving him of the very struggles and experiences required to forge an authentic adult identity. To achieve true adult realization, Siddhartha understood that he had to commit an act of radical abandonment and walk away from the golden cage entirely. He could not negotiate with the comfort of the palace, nor could he slowly transition his way out while keeping a safety net securely fastened inside the gates. This departure was not an act of ungrateful rebellion against his father, but a painful, absolute necessity for his own psychological survival and maturation. Siddhartha's story perfectly illustrates a terrifying modern truth. Extreme, frictionless comfort is often the ultimate enemy of personal growth. When every baseline need is effortlessly met by the infrastructure of your parents, the internal engine responsible for driving your independence quietly atrophies. To modernize this ancient dilemma, we must examine the clinical case study of the arrested remote worker. Consider a 26-year-old professional who, driven by the flawless pragmatic logic of saving money, remained in her childhood bedroom while working a full-time remote corporate job. On paper, the arrangement seemed like a massive advantage, offering zero rent, home-cooked meals, and a rapidly expanding savings account. However, the spatial confinement of living, sleeping, and working within the exact same 12 by 12-foot square began to systematically dismantle her adult identity and erode her professional boundaries. She was taking high-stakes corporate video calls while staring at the exact same ceiling she cried under when she failed her high school driving test, allowing the psychological anchors of her adolescence to bleed into her adult responsibilities. This environmental trap rapidly accelerated the erosion of her executive functioning and daily decision-making capabilities. Without the mandatory friction of managing an independent household, paying utility bills, organizing maintenance, or simply deciding what to cook for dinner, her domestic muscles completely withered. Her parents, operating on decades of ingrained habit, continued to do her laundry, buy her groceries, and manage the underlying rhythms of the house. While this felt like an incredible luxury, it was actually a slow drip poison to her autonomy, transforming a high-earning professional into a passive passenger in her own daily existence. She became entirely incapable of managing basic domestic life, waiting for the household to dictate her schedule rather than actively constructing it herself. Furthermore, the spatial reality of the childhood home absolutely decimated her dating life and severely crippled her social autonomy. An adult romantic life requires privacy, sovereignty, and an environment where you are the undisputed master of your domain, none of which exist under your parents' roof. Attempting to host a romantic partner in a bedroom located 20 feet down the hall from your parents' master bedroom is a psychological impossibility that forces you back into the behavioral patterns of a sneaky teenager. The arrested remote worker could not host dinner parties, freely invite peers into her space, or curate an environment that reflected her current identity. Her social development was effectively frozen in amber, permanently capped by the rules, aesthetics, and looming presence of her parents. This spatial confinement inevitably triggers the second major indicator of stagnation: profound psychological regression during moments of conflict. Pay close attention to the dynamics that unfold the next time you have a disagreement with your parents while living under their roof. You may be a 20-something professional with a degree and a salary, but the moment a conflict arises over a dirty kitchen counter, you involuntarily revert to the defensive, emotional posture of a 15-year-old. This regression occurs because the power dynamic of the childhood home is permanently fixed. It is their house, their mortgage, and their rules, perpetually casting you in the role of the subordinate child. You cannot negotiate as an equal adult in a space where you are essentially a long-term guest living on a childhood scholarship. This regression inevitably bleeds into how you view yourself in the broader world, damaging your external confidence and authority. When you spend the majority of your time in an environment where you are treated, even lovingly, as a dependent, your highly contextual brain absorbs that passive, subordinate energy. You unconsciously carry that exact same childlike posture into your career, your romantic relationships, and your personal ambitions, undermining your own potential. You are essentially demanding that the world treat you as a fully realized adult, while you return every single evening to a sanctuary that treats you like a child. This split existence creates a deep, exhausting psychological fracture, forcing you to play dress-up as an adult during the day only to strip off the costume the moment you walk through your parents' front door. Finally, we must calculate the invisible emotional toll of remaining in this dependent state while the rest of your cohort moves forward. There is a specific, quiet agony in watching your peers progress through the messy, difficult, but necessary milestones of true independence. You watch them sign leases, buy terrible furniture, navigate landlord disputes, and build their own autonomous lives from scratch. Meanwhile, you are sitting in your pristine, rent-free bedroom, watching your bank account grow, but feeling your self-esteem slowly rot from the inside out. You possess ultimate financial safety, but you are entirely bankrupt of the life experience required to actually function in the real world. The illusion of the childhood home is that staying just one more year will make you perfectly ready, perfectly funded, and perfectly secure for the future. But perfection is a palace that ultimately starves you of the friction necessary for growth. The hermit crab does not wait until it has a guaranteed, perfectly fitted shell waiting for it before it abandons its old one. It leaves because the pain of staying has finally eclipsed the fear of the unknown. You must recognize that the suffocating friction, the teenage regression, and the quiet shame of stagnation are the urgent, biological alarms of an organism that has fundamentally outgrown its container. The time to leave is not when it feels perfectly safe, but when the comfort of your parents' house becomes far more painful than the terrifying responsibility of claiming your own life. However, acting on that urgent biological alarm without an ironclad logistical framework is a guaranteed recipe for disaster. If the urge to leave your parents' house is the biological engine of independence, the brutal economic mechanics of your departure represent the actual vehicle. Consider the core metaphor of sealing a ship's hull before launching it into the unpredictable, violent currents of the open ocean. A massive galleon does not sink because the surrounding ocean is vast. It sinks because microscopic, Unseen, leaks allow the water to breach its defenses. Stepping out of your childhood home without a rigid financial strategy is the equivalent of launching a beautifully painted ship with a hull made of Swiss cheese. The open ocean of adult financial independence is entirely unforgiving and completely indifferent to your emotional readiness. While you are living with your parents, you are resting safely in a dry dock, shielded from the crushing hydrostatic pressure of the real world. In this dry dock, your parents are constantly patching your financial hull, absorbing the shock of fluctuating utility costs, property taxes, and grocery inflation. Once you slide down the ramp and hit the water, every single drop of fiscal responsibility falls squarely onto your shoulders. You must ensure that your vessel is completely watertight before the safety lines are ever severed. History provides a masterclass in this exact type of calculated departure through the early life of a brilliant, orphaned clerk on the impoverished Caribbean island of Nevis. Long before he became a founding architect of the American financial system, this young man desperately needed to escape the dead-end trajectory of his environment. He possessed an ocean of ambition, but he did not simply stow away on the first cargo ship bound for the mainland based on blind hope. He deeply understood that ambition without capital is just a fantasy, and that surviving in New York would require an impenetrable financial strategy. He spent years meticulously managing the complex trading ledgers of his employer, mastering the mechanics of international commerce, and proving his absolute fiscal competence. By demonstrating this extreme financial literacy, the young clerk secured vital sponsorships and capital from wealthy local merchants who recognized his potential. He effectively built a localized, ironclad investment portfolio out of his own reputation before he ever stepped foot on a gangplank. His departure from Nevis was not an emotional, chaotic fleeing of a bad situation, but rather a highly calculated corporate merger of his intellect and their capital. If he had sailed blindly without securing those precise fiscal triggers, he would have inevitably starved in the unforgiving gutters of Lower Manhattan. You must treat your own move-out date with the exact same ruthless, unromantic calculation, viewing your departure as a complex business transaction rather than a coming-of-age movie montage. The modern equivalent of this historical calculation requires acknowledging that basic, back-of-the-napkin math is entirely insufficient for survival. Most young adults use a deeply flawed, superficial formula when plotting their escape, simply comparing their monthly net income against the advertised monthly rent of an apartment. They look at a spreadsheet, see a positive number at the bottom, and automatically assume their hull is fully sealed and ready for the ocean. This dangerous oversimplification completely ignores the microscopic, relentless leaks that inevitably sink a newly launched adult within their first year. To understand how quickly this superficial math collapses, we must examine the modern case study of the hidden cost catastrophe. Consider a 24-year-old subject who felt entirely prepared to launch into independence, having secured a stable entry-level corporate job. He strictly followed the golden rule of real estate budgeting, ensuring his new rent was exactly 30% of his gross monthly income. On his perfectly color-coded spreadsheet, his financial hull looked impenetrable, leaving plenty of room for groceries, car payments, and weekend entertainment. He confidently signed a 12-month lease, packed up his childhood bedroom, and stepped into his new, empty apartment with a profound sense of victory. However, the brutal reality of the ocean breached his hull on the very first afternoon. He was instantly blindsided by a barrage of phantom expenses that never appeared on his simplistic rent-to-income calculation. First came the mandatory utility activation deposits, requiring hundreds of dollars in unexpected upfront capital just to turn on the lights and water. Then came the non-negotiable demand for an annual renter's insurance policy, followed by the sudden, shocking realization that an empty apartment contains absolutely zero infrastructure. He had to immediately purchase a vacuum, a trash can, cleaning supplies, bath mats, and an entire pantry of basic spices and condiments. Within 48 hours, these microscopic, unanticipated leaks had completely drained his checking account and forced him to pull out a high-interest credit card. By month 3, his carefully constructed spreadsheet was completely underwater, and the structural integrity of his financial hull was buckling. Because his margins were razor-thin and entirely reliant on best-case scenarios, a minor alternator failure in his car became a fiscal emergency. He was forced to choose between repairing his vehicle to get to work or paying his heating bill, triggering a cascading cycle of late fees and mounting debt. He only budgeted for the predictable, rolling waves of rent and groceries, leaving him entirely defenseless against the sudden squalls of emergency maintenance. He had launched his ship without sealing the leaks, and the ocean was aggressively pulling him under. Within 8 months, the mathematical reality of his situation became inescapable, and the threat of eviction loomed over his daily existence. The stress of constant financial drowning decimated his performance at work and completely erased the joy of his hard-won independence. Ultimately, he was forced to break his lease, absorb a massive financial penalty, and execute a deeply humiliating retreat back to his childhood bedroom. His failure was not a lack of maturity, ambition, or work ethic. It was a fatal misunderstanding of how a move-out fund actually operates in the real world. He budgeted for a flawless, frictionless existence in an economic ecosystem that exclusively operates on worst-case variables. To avoid the hidden cost catastrophe, you must completely overhaul your financial worldview and transition from hypothetical budgeting to aggressive stress testing. You cannot simply save up the first and last month's rent, buy a cheap sofa, and assume you are cleared for departure. You must systematically simulate the crushing financial pressure of the ocean while you are still safely anchored in the dry dock of your parents' house. This simulation requires brutal honesty and a willingness to artificially manufacture the exact financial constraints you will face upon moving out. If your simulated hull cracks in the safety of your childhood bedroom, you are objectively not ready to sign a legally binding lease. Begin this stress test by calculating your exact projected living expenses, factoring in rent, bloated utility estimates, groceries, transportation, and a generous margin for phantom costs. For 3 consecutive months, you must physically transfer that exact total amount out of your primary checking account and into an untouchable savings vault. You must live entirely on the remaining fraction of your income, mimicking the exact cash flow you will experience in your new apartment. If you find yourself scraping by, relying on credit cards, or secretly transferring money back out of that vault to cover a weekend dinner, your hull has a fatal leak. Failing this simulation is not a defeat. It is a life-saving diagnostic that prevents you from drowning in the real world. Beyond surviving the simulation, you must construct the ultimate financial ballast, a mandatory, fully funded 6-month emergency runway. This is not a vacation fund, a new car down payment, or a budget for aesthetically pleasing mid-century modern furniture. This runway is untouchable, liquid capital designed for one singular purpose: to keep you housed and fed when you lose your job or face a catastrophic medical crisis. Operating without this 6-month buffer is the equivalent of sailing across the Atlantic without lifeboats, hoping that the weather remains permanently sunny. This runway is the absolute, non-negotiable price of admission for true, sustainable adult sovereignty. With the simulation completed and the runway funded, you must now map out the exact fiscal triggers that objectively declare you cleared for launch. These triggers are not based on your emotional frustration with your parents' house, but on cold, unfeeling mathematical thresholds. Trigger 1 is the absolute elimination of all high-interest consumer credit card debt, ensuring you are not carrying toxic liabilities into your new life. Trigger 2 is the verified liquid presence of your 6-month emergency runway, sitting securely in a high-yield savings account. Trigger 3 is a proven, documented cash flow that comfortably absorbs the monthly stress test without requiring you to sacrifice basic human necessities. Only when these strict, objective economic conditions are met can you safely pull the chocks and slide your vessel into the water. You are no longer relying on blind hope, youthful optimism, or the desperate emotional desire for independence to keep you afloat. You have built an impenetrable financial hull, painstakingly sealed against the phantom costs and emergency leaks that sink so many of your peers. You are fully prepared to absorb the violent, unpredictable currents of the open market without ever needing to signal for a rescue tow. This brutal economic preparation is the ultimate act of self-respect, ensuring that once you leave the dry dock, you never have to return. With your financial hull completely sealed against the unforgiving ocean, you must now confront the biological reality of what it actually means to uproot your existence. Consider the botanical mechanics of a mature tree cultivated inside a highly controlled, nutrient-rich nursery. To maximize rapid early growth, the tree develops a massive, centralized taproot that plunges straight down, drawing highly concentrated, effortless sustenance directly from the caretaker. However, if this tree is ever to be successfully transplanted into the wild forest, the nursery must deliberately sever that central taproot before moving it. This violent, necessary cut is the only way to force the tree to rapidly develop independent, horizontal feeder roots capable of pulling vital nutrients from entirely new, unfamiliar soil. Your relationship with your parents operates on this exact same ruthless botanical principle. For over 2 decades, your childhood home has served as a massive, centralized taproot, effortlessly pumping domestic, emotional, and social nutrients directly into your daily life. You have never had to search for the soil of community or the water of daily routine because your parents meticulously provided it from a central source. However, true adult independence requires the deliberate, proactive severing of this centralized support system the moment you step out the door. If you attempt to transplant your life without cutting that primary emotional and domestic taproot, your independent feeder roots will completely atrophy, and you will slowly choke to death in your new environment. History provides a masterclass in the absolute necessity of severing this taproot through the ascension of a legendary 19th century British monarch. Before she became the defining ruler of an era, this young royal was subjected to the Kensington system, an incredibly oppressive, micromanaged framework designed by her mother. Under this suffocating system, the young royal was never allowed to walk down a staircase without holding an adult's hand, and she was forced to sleep in her mother's bedroom every single night. Her mother's calculated strategy was to keep her so thoroughly enmeshed and dependent that, upon taking the throne, she would be completely incapable of ruling without maternal guidance. The system was a manufactured, unyielding taproot designed to permanently arrest her sovereignty and keep her in a state of perpetual childhood. However, on the exact morning she was awakened and informed that the previous king had died, making her the reigning monarch, she executed a flawless boundary strike. Her very first royal decree was not a sweeping political mandate, a military order, or an economic reform, but a deeply personal, domestic command. She ordered that her bed be immediately removed from her mother's room and placed in a private chamber, entirely off-limits to her mother's control. She inherently understood that she could not possibly command an empire if she was still sleeping under the watchful, infantilizing gaze of her parent. This simple, non-negotiable relocation of furniture was a radical declaration of adult sovereignty, instantly destroying the parent-child hierarchy that had suffocated her for 18 years. You must apply this exact same sovereign boundary setting to your own familial dynamics the moment you decide to establish your own household. Many young adults make the fatal mistake of physically moving out while keeping the psychological and domestic taproot completely intact and fully operational. They take their laundry back to their parents' house every Sunday, raid their parents' pantry for free groceries, and call their mother to schedule their routine dental appointments. This is not true independence. This is simply an expensive, off-site extension of your childhood bedroom. To transition into a peer-to-peer adult relationship with your parents, you must aggressively decline their ingrained habit of managing your daily existence, forcing yourself to rely entirely on your own capabilities. To understand the catastrophic consequences of failing to sever this domestic taproot, we must examine the sociological case study of the enmeshed roommate. Consider a 25-year-old subject who successfully navigated the financial stress tests and signed a lease with 3 peers in a vibrant, bustling city. On paper, he appeared completely ready for independence, but his underlying domestic conditioning was entirely outsourced to his deeply enmeshed parents. Throughout his entire life, his mother had anticipated his hunger, managed his laundry cycles, and silently cleaned his bathroom without ever demanding his active participation. He had unconsciously absorbed the dangerous belief that domestic maintenance was a passive, automated background process rather than a daily, grueling responsibility. When he moved into the shared apartment, he automatically projected this deeply flawed parent-child dynamic onto his new, unsuspecting roommates. He left dirty dishes in the sink for days, genuinely assuming someone else's domestic gravity would eventually pull them into the dishwasher. He consumed communal groceries without replacing them and completely ignored the rotating chore schedule, acting bewildered when his roommates expressed intense frustration. He was not acting out of malice. He was operating on a corrupted social software that had never been updated for peer-to-peer cohabitation. He expected his roommates to unconditionally absorb his domestic incompetence the exact same way his parents had for over 2 decades. The social fallout from this enmeshed behavior was absolute, rapid, and entirely devastating to his new life. Unlike parents, who are biologically wired to forgive and accommodate the flaws of their children, peers operate on a strict, unforgiving economy of mutual contribution and respect. His roommates quickly recognized that they were not living with an equal adult, but rather an overgrown adolescent who required constant, exhausting management. Resentment rapidly toxified the apartment, leading to explosive arguments, passive-aggressive retaliation, and the complete, irreversible collapse of their friendship. Within 6 months, the social environment became so hostile that the lease was violently broken, forcing the enmeshed roommate into a humiliating retreat back to the infantilizing safety of his parents' house. The enmeshed roommate failed because he never developed the localized feeder roots required to sustain a functioning, reciprocal adult ecosystem. Your parents' love is unconditional, but the respect of the adult world is highly conditional and must be earned daily through competence and contribution. When you move out, you are entering a ruthless social marketplace where you are judged entirely by your ability to carry your own weight. You must proactively train yourself in the basic, unglamorous mechanics of domestic life before you ever sign a lease with another human being. You must become the undisputed manager of your own existence, capable of executing chores, managing conflict, and contributing to a shared environment without needing a parental supervisor. This radical recalibration also demands that you establish your new independent life entirely outside the gravitational pull of your childhood zip code. Moving 3 streets away from your parents is a massive strategic error that practically guarantees the central taproot will remain fully intact. When your childhood home is only a 5-minute drive away, the temptation to retreat during moments of minor friction becomes mathematically irresistible. You will find yourself constantly drifting back to your parents' dining table instead of learning how to cook, or retreating to their living room instead of facing the profound silence of your own apartment. You must deliberately engineer physical distance to force your own psychological adaptation, ensuring that a trip home requires actual logistical effort. By planting yourself in new, unfamiliar soil, you are biologically compelling your feeder roots to stretch out and discover new sources of community. You are forced to find a new grocery store, navigate unfamiliar streets, and establish a completely new routine that does not intersect with your adolescent past. This geographic friction is the exact catalyst required to forge a resilient, self-sustaining adult identity that can weather the inevitable storms of independence. You must build a localized support network of friends, mentors, and peers who only know you as the autonomous adult you are today, completely divorced from the child you used to be. This localized network becomes the new, horizontal root system that stabilizes your life and provides the vital nutrients your parents once supplied. Transitioning your relationship with your parents from a vertical hierarchy to a horizontal, peer-to-peer dynamic is deeply uncomfortable, but it is the ultimate act of mutual respect. You are no longer demanding that they spend their golden years actively managing your life, and you are no longer accepting the subordinate, passive posture of a dependent. When you finally return to their house for a visit, you do so as a sovereign guest, entirely capable of leaving when the interaction is over. You can engage with them not out of desperate logistical need, but out of genuine, unburdened affection and mutual admiration. By violently severing the taproot, you have not destroyed the tree. You have finally allowed it to grow to its full, towering potential in the open forest. Achieving this towering potential requires understanding that the physical act of moving out functions exactly like a massive, highly coordinated rocket launch. A spacecraft sitting on the launch pad requires an incomprehensible, explosive burn of millions of pounds of highly combustible fuel just to break the Earth's atmospheric grip. Moving day operates on this exact same principle of a massive, chaotic energy expenditure that is entirely unsustainable for long-term travel. You must burn an exhausting amount of physical and emotional fuel simply to escape the dense, comforting gravity of your family home. This initial thrust is violently disorienting, but it is the absolute only way to propel yourself into the frictionless vacuum of true independence. The logistical execution of this moving day is never a graceful, cinematic transition, but rather a grueling, sweaty, 12-hour sprint of raw physical labor. You are hauling heavy cardboard boxes, navigating the blind spots of rented moving trucks, and awkwardly disassembling the childhood furniture that once defined your entire existence. Because you are physically tearing your life out of its original foundation, the sheer mechanical effort leaves absolutely no mental bandwidth for immediate emotional processing. This explosive burn of kinetic energy is deliberately consuming your focus, propelling you out of the atmosphere before you have the chance to lose your nerve. By the time you finally drop the last heavy box onto the floor of your new apartment, your fuel reserves are completely depleted. History perfectly captures the terrifying reality of this exact moment through the meticulously plotted first solo transatlantic flight of a pioneering 1930s female aviator. For months, she had planned the complex logistics, studied the unpredictable weather patterns, and prepared her aircraft on the safety of the runway surrounded by a team of mechanics. But the exact moment her wheels finally left the tarmac and pointed toward the ocean, the deafening reality of her situation set in with absolute, chilling finality. There was no co-pilot to hand the controls to, no radio tower that could reach her in the middle of the Atlantic, and absolutely no possibility of turning back. She was entirely alone in the cockpit, suspended in the dark sky, relying purely on her own competence to survive the long, solitary night ahead. When your parents finally hug you goodbye and the front door clicks shut on your first apartment, you are instantly transported into that exact same solitary cockpit. The sudden, absolute silence of the empty room is deafening, marking the official beginning of a critical behavioral timeline that clinical psychologists often map as the first 90 days. This initial period of complete independence is a highly predictable psychological roller coaster, demanding intense emotional regulation as you navigate the turbulent transition into adulthood. You are no longer safely preparing for the future in a dry dock simulation. You are actively flying the plane in real time. The extreme, unyielding quiet of the cabin is your new reality, and you must rapidly learn to pilot the aircraft without a safety net. The first phase of this 90-day timeline is the adrenaline-fueled honeymoon period, typically lasting for the first 48 hours after the initial launch sequence. You are coasting entirely on the residual thrill of your escape, eagerly ordering expensive takeout, leaving your clothes on the living room floor, and reveling in the intoxicating freedom of your own domain. The empty, scattered cardboard boxes feel like triumphant monuments to your success, and the sheer novelty of walking around your own kitchen at midnight feels like a profound, unprecedented victory. You are completely high on the raw atmosphere of total autonomy, temporarily insulated from the crushing weight of the mundane responsibilities that are quietly unpacking themselves in the background. It is a euphoric, unsustainable state of domestic bliss that briefly masks the monumental challenge of what comes next. However, this manic adrenaline inevitably evaporates by the middle of the first week, slamming you violently into the reality of an isolation-induced panic. The shiny novelty rapidly wears off, the accumulated takeout boxes begin to smell, and you suddenly realize that this new apartment does not magically clean, stock, or maintain itself. The profound silence that felt so liberating just 2 days ago suddenly morphs into a heavy, oppressive blanket that magnifies your utter, inescapable solitude. This is the exact moment the powerful gravity of the family home tries to pull you back, whispering seductively that it is not too late to abandon the mission and retreat to safety. Your uncalibrated nervous system begins to interpret this extreme quiet not as peace, but as a dangerous lack of familiar environmental stimuli. This rising panic usually culminates in a highly predictable psychological milestone colloquially known among young adults as the first grocery run breakdown. You inevitably find yourself standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a supermarket aisle at 8 o'clock at night, staring blankly at a wall of dish soap, completely paralyzed by sudden decision fatigue. A terrifying realization washes over you that you are now entirely responsible for every single granular detail of your own survival, from buying toilet paper to remembering to purchase trash bags. It is a profound, unexpected moment of mourning for the effortless, invisible infrastructure of your childhood, where these items simply manifested in the cupboards without your input. This overwhelming realization often triggers a visceral, desperate urge to abandon your shopping cart and drive straight back to the comforting embrace of your parents' house. You must aggressively resist this urge at all costs, recognizing that retreating to your childhood home during this critical window of vulnerability will fatally abort the entire mission. Conquering the profound silence of your first few nights alone requires deliberate, proactive psychological strategies, rather than just passive, miserable endurance. When the isolation depression threatens to completely overwhelm you, you cannot simply sit on a bare mattress scrolling through your phone in the dark, allowing the quiet to consume you. You must actively confront the silence by turning on the lights, playing your favorite music out loud, and physically occupying the space to assert your undeniable ownership over the environment. You are actively training your nervous system to understand that this quiet isolation is not a threat to your survival, but rather the neutral, beautiful baseline of adult peace. To permanently ward off the creeping depression of the first 90 days, you must immediately design and ruthlessly execute a rigid framework of new daily rituals. Without the external, ingrained structure of your family's routine to dictate your schedule, you must become the strict, unforgiving architect of your own daily momentum. This means forcing yourself to make your bed the exact moment you wake up, opening the blinds to let in natural light, and taking the time to cook a basic, nutritious meal instead of ordering delivery. These microscopic acts of domestic agency are not just mundane chores. They are vital psychological anchors that firmly secure your new adult identity to your unfamiliar environment. Each completed ritual builds a crucial layer of self-trust, proving to your anxious, doubting brain that you are highly capable of sustaining your own life. As you force yourself through these daily motions, the terrifying, paralyzing vastness of your independence begins to rapidly shrink into manageable, localized victories. You slowly learn the exact, peculiar sound your refrigerator makes in the middle of the night. You figure out the optimal weekly time to do your laundry, and you successfully navigate your first minor crisis without making a panicked phone call. You are painstakingly building the complex, invisible infrastructure of a functioning adult household, replacing the chaotic adrenaline of the initial launch with the quiet, unshakable competence of routine. The apartment slowly transforms from a sterile, intimidating box of empty rooms into a deeply personal sanctuary that reflects your exact preferences, habits, and standards. You are no longer just surviving in a new space. You are actively commanding it with the authority of a sovereign individual. By the end of the first 90 days, the chaotic, exhausting burn of the launch sequence is finally complete, and your life settles into a stable, quiet orbit. The profound silence of the apartment no longer triggers a spiral of panic. Instead, it becomes a deeply coveted luxury that you fiercely protect from the outside world. You have successfully navigated the turbulent atmosphere of transition, proving to yourself that you can endure the isolation, manage the grueling logistics, and pilot your own existence without a co-pilot. The invisible, suffocating gravitational pull of your childhood home has been permanently broken, replaced by the unshakable confidence of a fully realized, self-reliant adult. You have survived the burn, stabilized your trajectory, and finally claimed the ultimate prize of total autonomy. The monumental effort required to step out of the shadows of adolescence and into the brilliant, demanding light of true sovereignty is the defining struggle of your youth. The journey is terrifying, exhausting, and completely unforgiving, but it is the absolute only path to discovering who you truly are when no one else is watching. You have officially taken the controls of your own life, and the vast, open sky of your future is finally yours to navigate. Thank you so much for watching this entire 4-part series and taking this incredible journey of independence with me. If you found value in this video, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who might need that final, crucial push to launch their own life.